In these times of uncertainty, it's all the more important that we keep collaborating, informing, and inspiring each other, so that we can be smarter and better tomorrow. Welcome to the Pakhuis de Zwijger livecast.
Welcome to this livecast on our future economies. Capitalism, despite the tremendous increase in worldwide welfare through its innovative power and freedom, has at the same time a number of negative consequences. A transition is necessary to overcome ecological destruction, decrease in quality of life, and growing inequality. Given geopolitical developments, Europe has an important role to play in this transition. In the livecasts, we will start an open dialogue and discuss this transition with internationally renowned economists from all over the world. Questions will pass by, such as: each week, we will discuss these matters with 2 economists, resulting in 10 online dialogues in 10 weeks, where we will share viewpoints and collect ideas on how capitalism's innovative and creative powers can go hand in hand with fostering an equal and just society. A different subject every week. Together we can build a basis for economies that are beneficial to all of us. You can participate by putting your questions and remarks in the chat. So, let's talk.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the second edition of The Future of Capitalism. And today we talk about the future role of business as a force for good. And we will do that with 2 fantastic economists. Last week we talked to Mr. Stiglitz and Mr. Van Rompuy, and today we will talk to Rebecca Henderson, who is an American economist at the John and Natty MacArthur University, professor at Harvard University. And her most recent work is here on the table, Reimagining Capitalism. And the other speaker we have invited, and actually we're so honored that he accepted our invitation, is Colin Meyer, and he's the Peter Morse Professor of Management Studies at the Said Business School at the University of Oxford. And his book, last book, which inspired us, is also on the table, Prosperity, Better Business Makes the Greater Good. And we will talk with these 2 brilliant minds to discuss, reimagine, perhaps we could say, the role and function of business within that market economy. Because as we are pondering whether Europe can develop its own type of market economy, a crucial question will be what the role of business is, and subsequently what type of market order is needed to allow businesses that want to be a force for the good to function properly and prosper. How can businesses be stimulated while other types of business may be discouraged? And is it only up to the morally inspired entrepreneurs themselves, or should we also look at other domains of society to make this happen? That is what we will discuss in 1 hour and 15 minutes. We have a lot to discuss, so let's start. And to kickstart this conversation between these brilliant minds, we have asked a think tank of young economists to always start these series of discussions. And today they have sent us the young economist, and he will start, Kees Buitendijk. The floor is yours.
Tonight, we talk about purpose, a highly relevant topic. Purpose is the key word to both of our guests in their search to transform big business. Purposeful corporations are in it for the long term. They create value beyond profit, treat their employees, customers, suppliers, the climate, and society at large with care. And in the end, corporations that put purpose first will thrive. A purpose in life is important to all of us. But how does a sense of purpose arise? I would say purpose is not formulated a priori. Purpose grows in and through our lives. Therefore, we should not put purpose first. We should put context and community first. Let me elaborate. The word purpose alone carries a strong feeling of textbook ethics with it. It is quite hard, if not impossible, to formulate universal principles of purpose, public benefit, or the common good. And it is even harder to subsequently measure and enforce these principles. Of course, we can agree on some general principles for better business, like reducing pollution or ending extreme poverty and hunger. These are great principles of no harm, aimed at the protection of people and planet. But just as we for ourselves would not say that avoiding poverty is the purpose of our lives, so is this not a full account of purpose for business. Many of the successful purpose corporations that are mentioned by Professor Henderson and Professor Meyer in their books are, in my opinion, not unique because they have put purpose first. They are unique because they are embedded in meaningful context. They carry with them a sense of place, a sense of belonging, a sense of commitment. They are family-owned, have strong local ties, have only a few committed investors, and stand in a long tradition of professional quality. Purpose originates in communities. Purpose exists in places where people meet eye to eye. Purpose grows through practice. Many small and medium-sized enterprises are examples of this kind of embedded business. For many local business owners, doing good is not an abstract and faraway concept, and contributing to the public benefit is day-to-day practice. They have a reputation to keep up, a care for their customers and employees, and an involvement with their local communities. Why is big business devoid of purpose? I would say it is because they tend to be disconnected from meaningful context. They are places of nowhere. They are system-oriented instead of relations-oriented. They are disembedded. Injecting abstract principles of purpose will not suddenly turn this around. If we want business to contribute to a better society and a greater good, I would like to suggest 2 lines of action. And I'm curious to see how our guests value them. First, strengthen local business. In this regard, Europe can build on a long tradition, especially in Scandinavia, the Spanish Basque region, and the Rhineland area. We have long records of cooperative and family-owned business. But as anywhere in the West, we can see local business, be it small supermarkets, bookshops, or farmers, struggling to keep up. As we move along in the corona crisis, governments can support small and medium-sized enterprises and promote entrepreneurship. Second, large corporations should strengthen senses of practice, place and community. How? By taking equity financing over debt financing and tax evasions, strengthen labor positions of employees, and democratizing workplaces. These are measures large corporations can take themselves, but if necessary, can be enforced by governments. I look forward to tonight's conversation. And let me end by rephrasing one of Professor Meyer's most important statements. Context and communities first, the rest follow. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Interesting kickstart of this conversation. and also very smart, of course, to quote one of the speakers who follows. If you will probably feel obliged to be honored by it. This is not a television show. It's a discussion in Pakhuis de Zwijger. And we invite all viewers to be part of this conversation. And if you're only watching online via live stream, please go to the Pakhuis de Zwijger site, in which you can find the link to go to the webinar. And then you can ask questions in the chat or in the Q&A. And in the chat, you can find other participants. And you can ask questions, and David and I will receive these questions, curated though, selected by the editors of this program, in here at the table. So we can ask our guests, and when do you have the opportunity to actually ask or go and discuss things with a professor from Harvard and Oxford? So use the opportunity. Without further ado, let's go to the in-depth interviews. Yes, and I will happily give the floor to David van Overbeek.
Thank you very much, Natasha. First off, Mrs. Henderson, thank you very much for being here tonight with us. Almost 50 years ago, Milton Friedman famously stated that the sole responsibility of a company is to increase its profits. Now, Friedman's legacy has been of great influence on many things over the last 50 years. Yet, also many seem to question its legitimacy to solve the problems we face today. Could you please state what is the legacy of Mr. Friedman?
Professor Friedman left a strong legacy. In the minds of many business people, particularly in the US and the UK, there remains the residual belief that the only duty of business is to maximize shareholder value. I believe in the current moment that's a mistaken belief and inconsistent with Professor Friedman's core beliefs, but it remains as a kind of taken for granted assumption in many boardrooms, for many investors, and to my mind, in very negative ways.
Now, these taken for granted assumptions, I think this is the one that you mentioned right now is one of many which are there. And part of the reimagining that we're trying to do here during this series is trying to reimagine and these assumptions that we hold as well. Well, before diving into the details of Mr. Friedman's legacy and what's wrong about it, what we can do about it, let me just first start off with the devil's advocate question. What did Milton Friedman 50 years ago get right about capitalism that appealed so much to people back then?
He suggested that free and fair markets are an incredible instrument for the generation of prosperity and freedom. And I must say, I completely believe him. I think genuinely free and fair markets are one of the great inventions of the human race. That there's nothing like having a whole bunch of entrepreneurs to compete to bring the products and services that people need to people who need them. What he, and you know, I want to go to where he went wrong, but I think the underlying idea that a market where people own their own assets, where they're not beholden to the state, gives people both prosperity and freedom. The freedom to work for whom they want and the freedom to be independent from the state. And both of those are fabulous features of capitalism.
Yeah. Now, this freedom that you mentioned, it is often said that a capitalist society, maybe in the style that Mr. Friedman envisions, is a necessity in order for this freedom to flourish. Do you agree with that?
I think a society in which the state owns all the means of production is going to have a much harder time supporting individual freedom. And I think the historical examples bear that out. Yes, I do.
So, Mr. Friedman's legacy has been of a large influence on many things, as we stated. What do you think that is part of this that we should address of his legacy? What part should we address? Which is the most imminent part that we should address right now?
The piece that worries me most, that I think is most important, is that Friedman essentially said, your duty is to maximize profits at any cost. I'm going to turn off my video, I think, but I'm going to turn off my video so my audio is better. Friedman says, maximize profits at any cost, but there should be an asterisk on that. If, for example, one of the easiest ways to maximize profit is to change the rules of the game, to flood the political system with money to enable you to continue making profits, that's not what Mr. Friedman meant. If one great way to make money is to pour literally billions of dollars, billions of tons of carbon dioxide out of the window for free, that's a great way to make money if you're a fossil fuel company, but it's destroying the environment. So markets only work their magic when they are genuinely free and fair, when the rules of the game are set by a transparent, effective, accountable democracy, and when externalities like global warming are properly priced. When those two things are not the case, then capitalism, just focusing on shareholder value, can be a disaster. And I think that's the moment we're in now.
That's very clear. Now, one of the topics that we are going to discuss tonight, and on which you both and Mr. Meyer seem to elaborate a little bit more, is the topic of purpose. Purpose seems to be paramount in order for business to change, in order to face these externalities that you mentioned just yet. Before we start that discussion, could you just lay out what purpose is and what purpose is in a business context?
For a company to have a purpose is to be authentically committed to some goal beyond profit maximization, ideally a pro-social goal. So, for example, in the case of Aetna, a US insurance company, the company was committed to trying to really make a difference in patients' lives, really improving the health of its clients, as opposed to simply maximizing the bottom line. And such a purpose is important because when push comes to shove, it shapes the investments that a firm makes. It shapes the way it treats people. So for me, an authentically purpose-driven company is one that operates a high-road employment system that treats people with dignity and respect, that gives them decent wages and decent benefits, and that gives them the tools and the freedom they need to get the job done, to get the purpose done. So a purpose-driven company is both how you manage people and having a much broader goal of the purpose of the firm in the world.
Yes.
And to be really authentic, the firm has to spend money on its purpose. So there have to be moments when the firm says, no, we're going to do this because it's in accord with our purpose, even though in the short term we will lose returns.
So in your book, you also discuss the distinction between high road firms and low road firms. What do you mean by that, and regarding this discussion of purpose that we're talking about?
Well, we've known for at least 100 years that there is a different way to manage people. And The Economist recently learned just 15 years ago that in every industry, the top 10% of firms are on average more than twice as productive as the bottom 10% of firms. And that's not a function of the quality of the capital that goes in. It's not a function of the training of the employees. I spent 15 years in windowless conference rooms trying to make that result go away. And the answer is a major part of that difference is driven by how people manage. That running a firm that really encourages intrinsic motivation so that running a firm in ways that encourage people to be intrinsically connected to what they're doing, giving them decent wages, decent benefits, a real purpose, is a way to unlock enormous amounts of productivity and creativity. And David, I can hear you thinking, well, I think I can hear you thinking, if this is such a great idea, how come all firms aren't managed this way? And there are at least two answers. One is it requires much more energy and attention. And the second, because you need to make a serious commitment to managing this way. If you're just focused on short-term results, if you don't understand the importance of really investing in purpose for the long term, it's easy to default to the low road. Just pay people the money and manage by the numbers and treat them as things. And so for me, what's so exciting about purpose is that it really pushes firms towards managing in a high road way.
Now, if I listen to you correctly, you emphasize this element of authenticity as well within a purpose-driven organization. So it's something that should come from within. Do you think that we can count on businesses to self-regulate with regard to this purpose, or do you think it should be enforced on businesses in some way?
Oh, I don't think purpose can save the world. I don't think purpose-driven firms can save the world. I think they might help. If we're going to reimagine capitalism, to rebuild markets so they're genuinely free and fair, and that we pay attention to the environment and to our societies, and we run firms as if both were really important, we're going to need fundamental changes in regulation and in taxation. We're going to need to rethink government and how it regulates business. I believe purpose-driven firms are important because at the moment, most governments don't look as though they're going to do that. And I think purpose-driven firms can have a catalytic effect on the firms around them in ways that encourage them to really move in this direction. So purpose-driven firms can exploit business models that let firms solve major social problems and treat their employees better. As they do that, they find out that, whoa, individual firms are not enough, that they must join together in self-regulatory arrangements like those in food, where the big food companies came together to say, look, we have to stop deforestation. And they focused on beef and soy and palm oil and timber, the world's big agricultural commodities. And working together, they really made a difference in deforestation, particularly in the Amazon. But those kinds of self-regulatory arrangements, they're really important. They make a lot of progress. Will they get us where we need to go? No. But they lay the foundation for two really important changes. One is in how we think about finance, and the other is the way in which we think about the relationship between business and government. And if we can drive all four of those changes, that might reimagine capitalism.
I'm glad you started about finance, Ms. Henderson, because you might say that one of the contexts in which this discussion is also currently living up is, of course, one of the aspects of modern day capitalism is financialization and increasing influence of financial firms on business decisions. Now, you could say that financial markets are inherently short-term oriented. Yeah, so how do we square this short-term orientedness of financial market with these long-term practices that we need within business?
I don't think financial markets are inherently short-term oriented. I think the problem with the financial markets is they're looking for an 8% rate of return. The financial markets funded Amazon. They fund the major pharmaceutical companies, which spend billions of dollars on long-term research, which won't pay off for literally 10 or 15 years. If you can persuade investors that what you're doing makes sense, and you have the metrics and you have the track record, you can focus on the longer term. The reason financial markets look short-term oriented and are experienced by many CEOs as such, and I have 25 years of corporate board experience, so I understand this, is that the investors think you must make your quarterly returns. Why? To show that the firm is under control. So if you just give vague plans for the future and you don't have good metrics, the investors won't support you. So one way to make the markets much more focused on the long term is better metrics. That's why ESG metrics and impact metrics, environmental, social, and governance and measures of impact are so important because they can support a changed conversation between firms and investors that will focus everyone on the long term.
Thank you so much, Ms. Henderson. We'll come back to that, especially the ESG ratings as well. Looking forward to going in depth in a few more minutes. But first of all, let's move to our next guest of tonight, which is Mr. Colin Meyer. Mr. Meyer, thank you very much for being here tonight. Thank you as well. In your book, Prosperity, you mention as well that we seem to be moving beyond this paradigm of shareholders first, if I can call it that way. What do you think is the most common myth that we keep hearing, that you keep hearing right now, which impedes us from moving beyond this paradigm?
Well, one of the myths I keep on hearing is that in essence, it's impossible to shift the attitude of investors towards promoting long-termism and purposeful business. And I think that that is fundamentally misconceived, that what we're talking about here is something that is beneficial for companies, for society, for employees, and for their investors. And what is not adequately realized is that it's not a matter of trading off benefits for long-term performance of companies in a financial sense against societal interests. It's in the benefit of all of us and all parties. And that is a terrible myth that leads to great confusion.
So can you give perhaps some examples of how this myth is debunked in reality?
It's debunked by doing the sorts of things that Rebecca and I are doing, and that is to provide evidence. It's based on a way of looking at performance that is solely focused on essentially short-term measures of performance. When you start looking at the influences on long-term performance of companies, one observes that there's a clear relationship between the extent to which companies do focus on a broader range of objectives, companies that have a real purpose to them, and companies that look after their employees, put their interests of their employees first, and thereby encourage the sort of engagement that's required to deliver that long-term performance. It's putting the evidence that we're beginning to accumulate that there is really a better way of doing business that is going to change people's attitude in this area.
Yes. In a recent article in Fortune magazine, you emphasized that corporate America in 2019 seemed to understand the cost of this narrow-minded view, you could say, of shareholder capitalism, and that you were quite hopeful back then that we were moving beyond this toward a more stakeholder-first oriented approach. Yet in this article, you mentioned that during this corona crisis that we're currently facing worldwide, that it has prompted some cynicism with regard to this transition or the original intentions of these firms. In what ways have large companies failed us during this corona crisis?
Well, we heard some very fine words from the Business Roundtable in terms of repurposing their business to deliver value to customers, invest in their employees, support their suppliers, contribute to their communities, and deliver long-term value for their shareholders. The evidence that's emerged to date in terms of how those same companies have responded is, to say the least, a little bit disappointing. And there is some evidence to suggest that during this pandemic, those same companies have, in some respects, underperformed their peers. Now, the issue that this raises is, to what extent are firms really going to walk the talk in how they actually implement these fine notions? And there are a number of elements that are encouraging in terms of developments that are taking place. So, for example, over the last few weeks, we've heard announcement from a large number of companies working together with some of the largest accountancy firms in the world, that they are really going to try and derive a set of metrics, a common set of metrics against which their performance can be evaluated. Now, that is an absolutely critical stage in this development, because to be able to move beyond the cynicism that has prevailed since that announcement, they need to really demonstrate that they are delivering on what they're saying they're going to do. And the way to do that is to measure it and to show that that performance meets up against those expectations.
Yes. So perhaps another way or another issue that is at stake here is what you mentioned in your book, Prosperity, which is the principal agent problem, which is at the heart of how businesses are comprised. Could you elaborate a little bit more on what this principal agent problem is for those who don't understand it, and why it is such a problem at the heart of modern day capitalism?
So the principal agent issue is the way in which companies and investors align the interests of management, with those who own and invest in companies. And over the last 60 or so years, we've seen a rapid growth in analyses of how companies can solve that problem in terms of aligning interests of management with shareholders. Basically, a lot of what we've observed in terms of remuneration and incentive schemes in companies have had that as their sole objective. Now, that's in part a reflection of that Friedman doctrine to which you referred earlier on, and that is the notion that the only reason that companies exist is to promote returns for their shareholders, in which case, the one problem that you want to solve is, well, how do you do that? How do you really align the interests of those running companies with promoting more returns for their shareholders? And basically, what's happened over the last 60 odd years is we've solved that problem brilliantly. So brilliantly that we've created massive problems elsewhere. Because of course, the purpose of a company is not simply to generate returns for their shareholders. One should regard those returns for shareholders as being derivative of the purpose of a company. The purpose of a company being to do something that is greater than that. Now, the way in which I describe the purpose of a company is in terms of solving problems. Why does business exist? Business exists because it's there to solve our problems as individuals, as societies, and the natural world. And what they're there to do is to find ways of doing that in a commercially viable fashion. In other words, in a way that is profitable. So the way in which I look at the purpose of a company is as being to profitably solve the problems of people and planet, and not to profit from producing problems for people or planet. Now that means that companies are there to produce profits, but those profits should derive from them solving problems. And therefore, what we want to do is to focus not just on metrics that measure performance in terms of a financial sense and to incentivize management to do that, but to incentivize, to measure performance and incentivize management to solve those problems that lie at the heart of their purpose.
Yes. So in the article in Fortune magazine, Mr. Meyer, you mentioned as well that perhaps we should put the purpose of business at the heart of corporate law. What do you mean by that exactly? Should we enforce by law the purpose of a company?
We have derived a system over the last 60 or so years, which has been brilliantly consistent in nature around this idea that the only purpose of business is to make money for its shareholders. And we've basically aligned everything with doing that. I've just described it in relation to measurement and incentives and remuneration within business. But it's also a feature of the way in which we've structured our policies, our laws and regulation. Those have been very much designed with the notion that the purpose of business is to make money. Now, if we're really to bring about a fundamental change in the way in which business operates around the world, we need to create as coherent a set of policies and forms of implementation around the notion of purpose as we have around the notion of profit. And that will mean, in due course, ensuring that the notion of purpose lies at the heart of company law. That is to say, at the moment, the way in which we design company law is around the success of the company, essentially in the interests of its shareholders. What we should be thinking about is how do we design our laws so that companies recognize that their fundamental reason for being, their reason for existing, is to solve problems and to solve problems in a profitable way. And that will, in turn, involve putting purpose at the heart of company law.
Is there a legal form of organizations currently, right now, about which you are very enthusiastic and which could, which could perhaps be at the future of the heart of capitalism?
Well, there are examples of laws of exactly that sort. There's actually one in the United States, or one that originated in the United States, which is called the Public Benefit Corporation. What the Public Benefit Corporation does is to say that the directors of a company have a duty to state a purpose, a public purpose, beyond just making money, and to ensure that they uphold and deliver on that public purpose, as well as delivering commercial returns for their investors. So there's a very good model that already exists that goes quite a long way in the direction of what I'm talking about. And it has been now adopted in some 37 states in the United States, and a large number of small companies have adopted this, but it hasn't yet been taken on board by many large companies. There are a few that are beginning to. Now, that's an illustration of the sorts of practical changes that have been and can be made, and which will in turn have a very significant impact on the way in which business operates around the world. And there are other laws that have been introduced in different countries. Here in Europe, and one of the reasons why Europe is potentially such a powerful location in thinking about these ideas, we see a massive variation, much more than you see in the United States, in the form in which companies are incorporated, the way in which they're set up and structured, because laws, company laws, vary appreciably across Europe. We think about America as being at one extreme in terms of capitalism. Actually, if anything, Britain is even more extreme in some respects than the US. But if you go elsewhere in Europe, you see very different types of company law. And in particular, there's a form of incorporation in Denmark and also in Germany, by which companies can form themselves under trusts or foundations, where the trusts and the foundations are responsible for promoting the corporate purpose. So that variety is one of the reasons why Europe is potentially very well placed to innovate in terms of the nature of business going forward.
Thank you, Mr. Meyer. Looking forward to going into more depth in just a few more minutes. Let's move over to the next section of this program.
Yeah, and that is, of course, the idea that two minds like these should meet and cross, because otherwise we can just read their books. So it's fun that they are in the same digital realm. So the first obvious question to Ms. Henderson would be, would you like to respond to Mr. Meyer? Sorry. Yeah.
Sure. There is one point in which I strongly agree with Professor Meyer, and two where I disagree. The place I strongly agree is that the purpose of business should be to solve public problems profitably. Colin, I've heard you say that before, and I've read your book, but for some reason today, that is just like, yes, that is exactly the right way to describe the purpose of a business. And so on that, we are completely agreed. We have two minor differences in emphasis. One is I fear there are some public problems we need to solve for which there is no good business model. And so I fear, for example, that even the most purpose-driven firms in the world cannot solve climate change. That you can reduce energy use in a firm by about 50% on a profitable basis, but the next 50% is much harder. That if we're going to transform energy and agriculture and construction and infrastructure, these massive industries, we must have appropriate government taxation and regulation. So when Colin says cheerfully, and I love the way he does this, the purpose-driven way is the profitable way, I think it often is, but not always. The second place we disagree, and again, this is a point of emphasis, is on the centrality of changing corporate law to addressing the problems we face. I think it's potentially powerful at the margin, but I do not think it is politically viable at scale across the major organizations. And I'm worried that it wouldn't get us exactly where we need to go. That even if you were to tell a board of directors that they had a public purpose, I'm not sure I want to trust those directors to make the right trade-offs across environmental costs or labor costs or social costs. So I place more faith in strengthening democracy and strengthening government. I think modifications to corporate law could be extremely helpful, and we could talk about some details. But in general, I'm not sure they're as powerful a tool as Professor Meyer believes.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let me just respond by saying that I think, Rebecca's doing a tremendous job of trying to suggest areas where we disagree, but actually we don't disagree. So first of all, let me be clear that I have not said that purpose-driven companies can solve all of the world's problems. I am saying that all companies should be trying to solve the world's problems. Okay? But there are many problems for which, of course, however hard a company tries to what is termed internalize an externality, they are unable to do so because it's simply not profitable for them to do so. And remember, my notion of a profitable, of a purpose company was one that solved problems profitably. So one of the areas that I'm working in is a program at the British Academy in London on the future of the corporation, where we set out the policy agenda that is required to promote the development of purposeful companies. And key to that is regulation and taxation. And so the notion of having a regulatory system that encourages companies to move in a purposeful direction is absolutely of critical importance. However, we also say that in many respects, regulatory systems as they're currently designed are not well situated to help promote purposeful business. What we need to have is more purposeful regulation. The way in which we design regulation at the moment is a sort of crime and punishment. You set the rules and you enforce the rules. Now that is important, obviously, in some areas, but there are many areas where you can do much better. And I'll give you an illustration. In response to the financial crisis, the immediate response was to try and introduce regulatory rules which would tighten the conduct of financial institutions. First of all, in particular in the US, but also in Europe, we then found those rules gradually being weakened as there was political lobbying by the financial sector. But secondly, and more significantly, regulators then realized, well, actually, there's more to it than that. There's also a problem of aligning the cultures of organizations and financial institutions with those rules. And so thinking about how does one design a regulatory system that actually promotes more purposeful businesses, in this case, financial institutions, is absolutely critical to the successful implementation of regulation, because otherwise you set the rules and companies have an incentive to maximize profits and do whatever they can to get around the regulatory rules. So you need to change the fundamental objective and culture of organizations. Now, in terms of company law is the basis on which a company is created. You know, companies are legal fictions, as lawyers sometimes like to describe them. That is to say, they are a product of a set of legal rules that define the nature of the organization. Now, we have defined the nature of companies in different ways over time. I described how they vary across Europe, but they've varied immensely over time as well. And in fact, the original legal notion of the corporation as it was established under Roman law was as a public organization, the Societas Publicanorum, which was there to perform public functions.
Yes.
Now, that notion of there being a strong public role associated with companies persisted through much of the history of the company. And it was really only over the last 60 years that we've seen this notion that the sole objective of a company should be focused on
is to make
shareholder
profit.
returns
Yeah.
coming to the fore.
Yeah.
What we need to do is to recognize that we don't have to be beholden to that. We're not undermining the commercial viability of companies by recognizing that one can put the notion of purpose at the heart of why they exist, namely their legal basis.
Okay, this is a very long rebuttal. If we do that, we can only have one or two of these issues solved tonight. So I'm going to urge you to shorten your answers, although I know that is a really almost an insult to professors of Oxford and Harvard. But anyhow, I'm going to do it anyway. Okay, so Ms. Henderson said, I agree that companies are the beautiful definition, Mr. Meyer, profitable solving problems, right? Institutions that do that, we call that companies. And then she said, but there are some public problems which cannot be solved by companies. And then you said, I agree with that. Okay, and then one example was mentioned, climate change. Let me ask that very shortly. What other problems we have to expect that companies won't be able to solve that other than climate change? Some examples, Ms. Henderson, and then some, Ms. Meyer. Mr. Meyer?
Labor policies. I don't think we can address inequality through companies alone.
Okay.
That the temptation to push wages down and create bad quality jobs is too strong.
Yes. Clear.
So, and the second area would be getting money out of politics, which is critically important, but companies might help with, but cannot be relied on to solve.
Clear. Mr. Meyer?
So I'd add to that list social inclusion, so diversity. You know, there are areas in which companies will act on their own, but there are many where they won't. And secondly, I think in the area that we're just observing, public health.
Yes.
Okay? I think that business has an important role to play. But my goodness, have we needed governments and regulation?
Clear. So, and Ms. Henderson, you are nodding. So probably these public goods, which you mentioned, cannot be solved by corporations alone. So for that, we need other institutions. And if we want to reimagine capitalism, we also have to think about their boundaries, what they can and can't do. And you say, let's leave that out of the equation because they won't be able to solve it by themselves. But for the rest, you say, okay, so we need better democracy and thriving communities, right? Which take their democracy serious. We need public institutions that function and maybe in emancipation of the state again or the public functions. But let's focus on these companies now. And then you say, they can be the ones who are already purpose-driven can be a catalyst to more change for the good, right? Let's focus on that now, because you also mentioned that laws and regulations and taxations are necessary, but they won't solve it by themselves. We also need to look at culture and other instruments. Can we elaborate a bit on that now? So we know we have to have some policies from government, regulations, laws, clear. But how can companies that already are an example be a catalyst movement to create a much bigger community of corporations which are functioning for the good?
They can illustrate the point that Professor Meyer made, which is that acting purposefully does not mean necessarily giving up profits. So we see firms like Tesla demonstrating that if you focus on electric vehicles because you want to change the world, you can build a large, still not profitable, but very valuable company. You see it in entrepreneurial firm after entrepreneurial firm, as for example in Impossible Foods and Beyond Meat, where purpose-driven firms are showing there's a big market for plant-based meats and that consumers want it. So demonstrating new business models is hugely important, showing other firms that this is a safe path to travel. And as those firms travel this safe path, they learn that, oh my goodness, we have a collective action problem, that it is profitable if we could solve climate change, if we could address issues of exclusion and inequality, the whole economic system would be better off. And so they can act as ambassadors and partners in addressing some of these much larger, more collective problems.
We get a question from the audience, which is watching this live stream. And unfortunately, I don't know who asked it, but he says, how can firms be truly responsible and purposeful if many of the ingredients or services they use are imported from elsewhere? That would imply that firms also start to interfere with the supplier strategies. So that is about the scope, right, of the responsibility or the purposefulness of a company. Which one of you? Yeah, Mr. Meyer, yeah.
I think that's a really important issue, that one shouldn't believe that the responsibility of a company stops at the factory gate. That the company is responsible for what goes on in its supply chain and in its distribution chain, as well as within its illegal boundaries. And that's something that is increasingly being recognized. We only have to understand the way in which the notion of contracting out activities around the world is suddenly being reversed when companies realize the potential vulnerability that they face from not understanding what's going on in their supply chain. We've had one example of that in Britain recently, the company Boohoo, which was caught out for having purchased materials and supplies from factories that were employing people in very poor conditions in Britain at wages that were below minimum or living wages. And it suffered terrible reputational damage as a consequence of that. Now that recognition is increasingly being recognized by companies as something that they have to take control of. And we will see that happening increasingly going forward.
Another question with the competitiveness, because Govert is asking that, Buis, businesses that operate with a broad sense of purpose might run into problems with competing businesses who are not. How can you should you create a level playing field? What is your take on that, Ms. Henderson?
Absolutely. That's why government action is so important.
Exactly.
But purpose-driven firms run into low-road firms that are cutting corners all the time. One of the things I think is important is to remember that being purpose-driven doesn't just mean about talking about puppies and kittens and giving great speeches. It means managing your business really, really well so that you compete as effectively as possible with those firms that are not yet on that wavelength. Every purpose-driven CEO I've met who's really understood this has been almost schizophrenic. They can move from being incredibly visionary and focused on the larger picture to turning to one of their managers and saying, and your sales are down this quarter. And why is that? So you need both the traditional management skills and this broader framework in order to build a successful purpose-driven firm.
Yeah.
If I could just add to that quickly by saying, I think one of the products of the current crisis is that is bringing that element out to the fore insofar as companies that are taking the high road are being recognized. Those that are not taking the high road are being called out. And that is changing attitudes about companies about the merits of following an approach that is more purposeful in nature.
So, Ms. Henderson, how can we then, for example, revitalize these governments and institutions in order to ensure this level playing field for all these firms?
In a minute?
Well, do you have a minute?
I think it's very important that business becomes deeply involved in civics, not politics. but civics, making sure that the underlying democratic institutions are strong, that everybody has the chance to vote, that government is properly funded, that it's an honor and a privilege and well paid to work in government service, that there is real partnership between business and government. And so business needs to think of itself as a partner in a much broader system rather than, I just put my head down and make money and that's all I need to worry about.
It was a lovely advertisement, I think, of companies which said, please let us pay more tax. We love public expenditure. We need public expenditure and we want to pay tax. That is an example of what you mean, right?
Exactly. Or giving all your employees the day off to vote, or lobbying to get rid of, in the United States, the amendment called Citizens United, which basically said unlimited spending in political campaigns by anyone. Our business needs to be standing up and saying, that's not good. That's not good for any of us.
Now, you could also say that perhaps one of the most common myths that people hold is that governments are in some way incompetent when it comes to these kinds of arrangements, and that you need businesses in order to get the job done. And that part of what we're trying to do here, this reimagining, is trying to emphasize these myths that are out there. I think this is one of the myths which I encounter all the time when talking with people about these sorts of things. What would you say to someone who holds that belief?
Are you asking me, David?
Yes, and afterwards, Mr. Meyer as well.
Okay, so just very quickly, that many people say that government is incompetent, but when you ask them about particular programs, do you like your pension fund? Do you like your healthcare system? Often they're pretty happy. And that many of these views, government is incompetent and should be thrown into the bathtub, are the results of a systematic campaign to run down government and defund it. So if you do that, if you have many interests actively trying to destroy government, over time, people come to believe that government is incompetent. If you have an administration that comes in and fires or forces out the decent civil servants, you'll get a government that works less well. So I think it's both important, both to point to where government is working well and to point out we need to rebuild our understanding of government and what it can do.
Yeah. So Mr. Meyer,
your answer,
first
yes.
Your answer.
So I think we're really learning the lesson of this from the current crisis, because before the crisis, there was a growing view that business was becoming bigger than government, and that business was taking over a lot of the roles that government was expected to perform. What we're now realizing is that actually business was very dependent on government and is being bailed out by government. And that's giving rise to a completely changed attitude about the social compact between business and government. There's now a growing view that it was quite right to bail out business, but it was on the back of a presumption that in turn business would respond not simply by bringing our economies out of recession, but doing so in a way that would benefit society at large and help to benefit stakeholders as well as the shareholders and investors in companies. Now, it's absolutely critical that social compact is recognized and that companies do that. If so, we're going to see a real partnership emerging between government and business going forward.
Do you really see a shift also in that belief of companies themselves, in the attitude of companies towards the functioning of government, right? Do you see a shift in that attitude due to this corona crisis and the response all over the world governments took?
Absolutely, because there has been a growing recognition of the exposure of companies to the type of systemic risks that the pandemic has revealed. That there is, before the pandemic crisis, there was an understanding of the need for government to be able to sort out systemic risks in relation to the environment. Now we're seeing it happening in relation not just to health risks, but to questions that the Black Lives Matter campaigns raise in terms of the exposure that companies have from that type of systemic risk as well. So suddenly there's a perception and an understanding that business really needs government to help it solve problems. And so we're observing increasing pressure coming from business circles to encourage governments, quite ironically, to take leads in this area. And that's absolutely right.
That would be a force for the good, right? A shift like that, because Govert Buysse, who's also watching, is reflecting on this answer and saying this didn't happen 10 years ago. We bailed out the banks in the financial crisis, and they didn't change their attitudes or their perception on the value of regulation by government, right? Or do you disagree with Govert?
Absolutely right. That was precisely the problem that occurred during the financial crisis. Again, at the time, people were supportive of a bailout of the banks because they recognized that keeping our financial systems going was crucially important. That then rapidly turned to cynicism when they realized that actually banks were exploiting that and they were not responding in terms of recognizing their social license to operate. That's what makes it particularly critically important that this time round, business does not make the same mistake, because the consequence of making that same mistake and not really supporting societies and economies going forward will be to have not just more intensified regulation, but a serious clamping down on the whole of our capitalist system. So it is absolutely key that we see a different response in this crisis from what we observed in the financial crisis.
Yeah, hopefully we've learned as a world society. Mark van Andel is still a bit skeptical about the debunking the myth of the power of the corporation in comparison to the government, and he argues that many governments, Ms. Henderson, are not successful and functioning, rogue states, dysfunctional states. And he argues that markets with boundaries set by government are much more efficient than those dysfunctioning states. Can you add a little bit on well, let's say, can you answer Mark van Andel's worries?
Absolutely. Many states don't function well at all. One of the central ideas of development economics is that to make societies really thrive and prosper, you need a free market supported by the appropriate rules. And in order to get those rules, you need a functioning government. Clear. And so that's why what feels to me so critical is, as Professor Meyer said, that business should realize how important governments are in enabling them to solve society's problems, and in places which have dysfunctional government, do everything they can to fight back against the corruption, to support moves to better functioning, to do everything they can to build that strong institutional structure that allows societies to thrive.
Yeah. It's very clear that also in the conversation we had last week with Mr. Stiglitz and Mr. Van Rompuy, that if you want to reimagine capitalism, you also have to rethink the state and the democracy as it is right now. So it's clear that it's also wonderful that economists are promoting a better functioning democracy. And it's, well, very logical. And thank you so much for answering this question. The question which was still laying on the table was in the introduction where Mr. Buitendijk Kees Buitendijk was asking you whether multinational companies can actually be purposeful. And he asked us to look at small and medium-sized companies because they are locally based. Is there something to be said about scale and the purpose economy?
Well, I think he was absolutely right to emphasize the importance of context and community. Having a local presence, being a family firm, allows you to build up relations of trust with parties in your local communities. But really, we cannot just survive on small local firms. We have to recognize that big business has a very important role to play. And indeed, the most successful multinational firms are ones that understand how they can take advantage of access to global markets, global supply and global distribution chains, and keep a local presence. And the key to that is an absolute central part of being a purposeful business. And that is to delegate decisions down organizations so that you empower people lower down in the organizations to be able to take decisions, to be able to act as if they were running local firms in local communities. And what we've lost in the way in which we've built many of our multinational corporations, in large part because they have been so focused on profits, is that notion of building up trust within the organization that then allows companies to build up trust with local communities.
Ms. Henderson, your reflection on the question? I was asking whether Ms. Henderson could also reflect on the question of the role of scale in this discussion.
I agree with Professor Meyer and with the gentleman who gave the first talk, that in their best forms, firms rooted in community are very purpose-driven and naturally create value for the whole society. The research suggests, however, that there's no necessary link between being local and private and being profitable or purpose-driven. That there are, alas, many family firms that are not very profitable and perhaps don't generate that much social value at all. So I think to leave aside the large firms is a mistake. Certainly we need to regulate the large firms so they do not get too big and too powerful, so that they cannot use their power to suppress local firms or keep small firms in their place. So I think maintaining a healthy balance is central to building a good society.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about the last sentence you made. It's also a topic we already discussed last week, and somehow we really, if we want to reimagine capitalism, we have to talk about the too big to fail or the too powerful companies. What is your suggestion to how do we deal with that? The too big to fail or too powerful concentrated powers within businesses? What should we do?
It varies depending on the industry and the company. I was the US government's expert witness in the Microsoft case, and I was the witness who recommended breaking up Microsoft.
Yes, I know.
And I think in many of these cases, these firms can be broken up and that would increase public benefit. In others, I think it's very clear they need to be regulated. The idea, for example, that the big information platforms such as Facebook and Google are free from the classic kind of regulation that media channels had to deal with is crazy. They are media platforms. They need to be regulated as media platforms. And so I think as we go from firm to firm, industry to industry, it is possible to find smart regulation which will make sure that no company is too big to fail and no company is too powerful to curb.
Clear. Would you like to add to that, Mr. Meyer?
Yes, I mean, I agree with the aspiration that we can design regulation, but I also think we need to recognize how difficult it is going to be to do that. Let's take the example of Google or Facebook. You know, those aren't just big corporations. They are really international, not just in a multinational sense of sourcing around the world. Their products are truly international. A social network benefits from having a global market. And therefore, national regulations that are set at state levels have an inherent difficulty in terms of controlling organizations like that. And so while one can do something in terms of avoiding the worst abuses through national regulations and encourage international coordination, at the moment, we don't have the political harmony that's going to be required to create that real international coordination of regulatory systems.
Yeah.
And that's why, to my mind, the notion of changing the inherent purpose of a business to recognize it's actually not there to exploit a monopoly abuse. It's not even there to exploit abuses in terms of uses of data in case of social networking companies. They have to think of ways of solving problems, not creating problems.
Clear.
And in particular, we have to find a way of ensuring that they don't actually profit from producing those types of problems. Because if we just rely on regulation to solve those problems, we won't.
Clear. Thank you so much for until this moment. We're now going back to Kees Buitendijk, who started this discussion, and we're going to reflect on what he heard so far. Kees, what is your reflection? You kick-started this conversation.
Well, there was one statement by Professor Henderson that appealed to me very much. It was the statement, business needs to be embedded in civics.
Yeah. Not in politics, but in civics.
Not in politics, but in civics. And for me, that opens one of the most exciting parts of this discussion. Because when we were talking about civics, what are we talking about? And she rightly pointed to the importance of democratic structures.
Yeah.
My question is, I'm struggling with the question: what are democratic structures? Are we only talking politics? Are we only talking government, or are we talking about more than politics and government?
Oh, that in 30 seconds. Yeah, very good. Ms. Henderson, what do you mean when you talk about civics?
Oh, Kees is so right. Strong, healthy societies rest on three foundations: free market, democratically accountable, capable government, and strong civil society.
Yes.
And we must have free media, labor representation, strong forms of social capital or local connection at the community level. It's these three pillars that maintain a strong society. Kees, you are exactly right.
Very good. Okay, so you get points for this question. Did they answer your struggle? You were struggling with the purpose part, right? You said it seems textbook ethics.
Yeah.
Did they explain to you what they meant? And could you?
Yes, they did. And I was, in preparation to this evening, I was thinking about the example of asking my local bookshop owner what his or her corporate purpose would be. And I think in this hypothetical situation, they would look at me quite warily. That to me, this is the big divide between local, maybe what I call embedded business, and big business, large corporations that can handle abstract principles, general ideas of purpose.
So, have you got a better idea, a better understanding of this situation?
Yes, and I'm also already looking forward to some of our next conversations, because I'm also curious. Maybe we could even ask both guests for tonight what the specific role of Europe is in this regard. Civil society was just mentioned. I think Europe has a unique position in between supermarket, the United States, and superstate China.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for being our guest and not a moderator, because in 1 minute and 35 seconds, I cannot elaborate on the specific qualities of the European cultural history on the state and market configurations. But we will have to discuss that another time. And we have, of course, eight sessions left to discuss that. And of course, we don't just have these deliberations, but we also have the books to actually inspire us even more. If we have we just got some small answers from these beautiful minds. So I would like to thank them for being here in this Amsterdam venue. Thank you so much that we could put your minds in one realm and listen how you, as friends, are thinking together on this subject. Thank you so much. Thank you, Kees, also for kickstarting this meeting. And I would like to thank all the audience who have asked many questions, some which we could ask, some we couldn't. And we invite you kindly for the next week's session, where we have Mr. Paul Collier and Raghuram Rajan on the role of non-market actor, the Civic Society. So we're going to discuss that elaborately next week, and we invite you all to join us then again. Thank you for watching and participating, and see you next week. Look on moralmarkets.org if you want to know more.